As I can do. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this opportunity just to come together and just to reflect on our thoughts upon you and the research that we are doing, and especially Simon presenting this afternoon. We ask for your blessing upon him, also your blessing upon us as we listen to his paper. And yeah, Father, we just ask you to bless us as we try to get a better understanding of your grace, better understanding of who you are, your love, and your creation. And so, Father, bless us through this afternoon. We ask in Jesus' name.
Amen. Sam is waiting in the lobby.
Yeah, Sam. That's good. But
Sam, what's good? Okay.
yeah. Hi, Sam.
Good to see you, Sam. Or,
Yeah, good to see you all.
yeah. Is Alistair too? Okay, good. All right, I think we'll make start with this here too. Great. We can start now. Simon Burton, some of you know him. Some of you maybe don't know him so well. He is the John Lang Senior Lecturer in Reformation History at the University of Edinburgh, so working at New College. He's in 3 or 4 days a week, so if you want to go and knock on his door, that's where he is. That locates him, literally. This is the last in our sort of the long and winding road of the research seminars that we've had here, going back to last September. So the last one before the summer, and we'll reconvene at some point in the autumn, but we're not thinking very hard about that at the moment because we're all kind of rather tired probably. But we thought it would be good to go outside, not just because of what's all Simon's achievements and his knowledge that kind of is reflected in those achievements, the fact that he's written 3 sizable monographs, one on Richard Baxter, another one on Ramism, and one on Covenant Puritan theology, as well as being editor of many other books, not least on Nicholas of Cusa, and is interested in the project of the Long Reformation, really heading that up, based at New College, Edinburgh. The Long Reformation, how long is the Long Reformation? As well, it can stretch from 1400 in terms of Simon's interests in people like Nicholas of Cusa, and to some extent maybe even John Wycliffe, who's squeezed in there, and Lollards, etc. But it can also extend right about 1700 to include people like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who is kind of at least part of what we're going to be talking about today, and what Simon's going to be talking about. So the Long Reformation is really quite long, but it sort of it goes against the kind of periodization of church history and history of Christian theology into kind of little neat sections. I can remember being asked on my first week at St Andrews, when I was a teaching fellow in church history, being asked by the Master of St Salvator's College, so which century was mine? And I said I didn't really have a century.
Yeah.
I had a biblical book that I was working on, yeah, but it wasn't a century. But that wasn't a very good answer for him, but because he was a historian. Keith Brown, who did the History of Scottish Parliaments project, amongst other things. Anyway, but Simon is somebody who manages to take the kind of the rich resources of what is still fairly traditional church histories department at Edinburgh University, and yet add to it something of sort of looking at interesting theological trajectories and theological topics and topics to the spiritual life, etc. So Simon, I will be quiet and let you have the floor. Maybe you could just read out what the verse, right about
yes, okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be back at HTC, and this comes from a book I'm working to finish at the moment. It comes from kind of the last chapters, and it presents a kind of set of arguments. So I'll be very grateful for any feedback. There's a lot more to say about all of the individual arguments in their context, and I'll be happy to kind of discuss that after as well. The title is Franciscan Enlightenment, Ramism, Idealism, and Universal Harmony in Jonathan Edwards. In his celebrated outline of his rational account, the grand project which dominated his early writings, Jonathan Edwards expressed his desire to show how all arts and sciences, the more they are perfected, the more they issue in divinity, and coincide with it and appear to be as parts of it. and to show how absurd for Christians to write treatises of ethics distinctly from divinity as revealed in the gospel. Notably, such an aspiration is deeply redolent of Ramism, the system of logic and pedagogy pioneered by the 16th century Huguenot philosopher and martyr Petrus Ramus, which achieved runaway popularity in early modern Europe and especially in Edward's New England. Central to Ramism was the Platonic notion of exemplarism, the understanding that all of reality mirrors and participates in the divine reality of God himself. Ramis thus held that all of the arts and sciences were grounded in divine ideas in the mind of God emanating out into the world. In this, as Ken Emery has insightfully suggested, Ramis thus closely followed a Franciscan Bonaventure Bagnareggio in seeking a comprehensive reduction of all the arts to theology. Yet despite the evident affinities, Edward's connections with Ramism, let alone a Franciscan vision of the world, have scarcely been noticed. Indeed, only David Hill Scott and especially Stephen Daniel have explored Edward's Ramist connections in any detail. And Michael Raposa has written a very interesting article connecting Edwards to Scotist semiotics, a topic that will come up in a few minutes. In my paper today, I'm seeking to build on the work of Daniel to explore Edward's early Ramism and also reevaluate the genesis of his kind of controversial but also celebrated idealism, the notion that only ideas and spirits are what actually exist. Recent studies by Scott Fennemar and Philip Fisk have also revealed important connections of the young Edwards to Bishop Berkeley and the mature Edwards to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, two of the most important representatives of Enlightenment idealism. Importantly, as Daniel has argued for Berkeley and Lohmke and Maria Rosa Antoniazza and Howard Hodgson have argued for Leibniz, both philosophers also had an important Ramist formation. Repositioning Edwards between Berkeley and Leibniz thus allows for a new appreciation of the nexus binding Ramism and idealism to far-reaching accounts of Trinitarian and universal harmony. In Berkeley and Leibniz, as well as Edwards, Ramism and idealism empowered a new Christian philosophy with deep affinities with Bonaventure and Scotus, thus shaping a kind of budding Franciscan Enlightenment. So beginning actually with Berkeley, who was educated at Trinity College Dublin at a time when Ramism was still very prominent on the curriculum there. And in approaching Berkeley's depth to Ramism, the fault lines between Stoicism and Platonism become very significant. For Daniel, it's the Stoicizing aspects of Ramism which are particularly crucial for understanding its attraction to the Irish philosopher. For him, Ramism embodies a propositional view of reality in which propositions and not things or substances form what he calls the aboriginal elements of thought and existence. Things don't have meaning intrinsically, but only in virtue of their kind of function in rational or logical discourse. So what's key is not the existence of things, but the actual way that things argue and can be made to argue. And from here, it's a small step to the claim evident in Berkeley and Edwards that everything that exists are simply propositions or thoughts in some way in the mind of God. Now, my own reading of Ramism is more Platonic, and it's notable that Ramus and his followers do actually treat logical arguments as standalone features of the world. But Daniel is right to detect a Stoic undercurrent, evident, for example, in the German Ramist Johannes Piscator, who held that logical arguments and propositions are mutually entailing, so they're not able to be understood without that which is argued, a kind of holistic kind of view. Or in Alexander Richardson and William Ames, two Ramists thought to have influenced Berkeley and definitely Edwards, both of whom espoused a fully fledged propositional realism, according to which not only logical terms or arguments, but also propositions, syllogisms, and even logical method and a method of whole disciplines have a real existence outside the mind. And so there is a sense in which Ramism could be seen as embodying a kind of proto-idealism. But what's key really is Berkeley's, what's key to Berkeley is Ramism's embodying of what people call a theo-semiotic account of reality. Now, in this view, often associated in the literature with Bonaventure and Scotus, but others as well, the universe becomes expressed as a network of signs mirroring the mind of God. And both Daniel and I see Ramism as embodying a kind of divine logic for its practitioners, according to which God communicates the order found in things themselves to the human mind. And it's notable that Berkeley also had a deep desire to uncover the language of God in creation, taking out the common Augustinian and Franciscan account of the world as the book of God or the volume of nature. Berkeley holds it the task of the philosopher to learn to read and understand this properly, and especially to appreciate the complex network of significations. As he put it, the connection of ideas does not imply the relation of cause and effect, but only of a mark or a sign with the thing signified. For Berkeley, the Ramist logical relation of cause and effect, which was actually the heart of lots of Ramist thought, must therefore be transposed into the relation of sign and thing signified. Now, these signs are not arbitrary, they're instituted by the author of nature. And so in studying reality, we conform our own language more and more to the language of God. Now, continuing this kind of semiotic understanding, it's significant that Berkeley holds that ideas, which I think for him really are the kind of aboriginal elements of reality, can also be seen as a kind of alphabet of nature. As he expresses this, the reason why ideas are formed into machines, interesting term, that is artificial combinations, is the same with that for combining letters into words. Indeed, from just a few original ideas, it's possible to form an enormous number of combinations signifying all of their different effects and actions. And importantly, he holds that such combinations must always be governed by rule and wise contrivance according to a kind of method. Now, such a combinatorial understanding of reality vividly recalls Ramism and the machinery of Ramist logic. But it also recalls something that underlay Ramism, which is a Franciscan method called Lullism, according to which the world is seen as a combinatorial kind of system of ideas, and logic is tapping into that kind of pattern. So while it's arguable that an approximate source for this alphabetic reading of nature could be found in someone like Francis Bacon, as Paolo Rossi's argued, it really does have Lullist and Ramist roots. Indeed, Berkeley here seems to recall the trope of the Lullist Ramon de Sebond, who became famous when Montaigne took up his cause, who held that individual creatures as letters of the alphabet combined together to form words and propositions in the Book of God. And interestingly, I can't go into it, but Berkeley also seems to suggest a kind of algebraic understanding of reality, and that was something that Ramist pioneered and which he would very likely be familiar with from mathematics textbooks at Trinity College. Like Richardson, who's thought to have influenced him, and following a long Augustinian and Franciscan tradition, Berkeley clearly assumes that reality isn't just vocal or propositional, but it's also luminous as well. Now, for Ramist, drawing on what we call the kind of the Franciscan Neoplatonic metaphysics of light, logical arguments and the way that logical arguments combine into propositions and syllogisms all radiate the kind of divine light of intelligibility. For William Ames, drawing explicitly on Scotus, the Franciscan theologian, logic also provided a direct intuitive connection to reality. And Richardson even compared logical arguments to colors of light emanating from a thing and reaching the human mind. Now, this is really relevant for Berkeley because his idealism was very shaped by his early the new theory of vision. Indeed, his philosophy makes a lot of the fact that contemporary accounts of vision denied that colors were intrinsic in objects, but rather held they were simply effects of the perceiving mind. And really, Berkeley's idealism is a kind of extrapolation of that claim, not just to colors of light, but to sensible and tangible experiences and all other kind of sensible experiences. For Berkeley, it's a consequence of this intuitive approach, and he does use that term, to reality, that any sensation or idea, therefore, cannot exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving them. As he famously put it, the existence of an idea consists in being perceived, esse est percipi in Latin. Indeed, Berkeley is insistent that to say anything about the existence of unthinking things without relation to their being perceived is not just wrong, but it's actually unintelligible. They cannot exist out of the minds or the thinking things that perceive them. And here we do see with Daniel that Ramistic vision according to which things exist in relationship and in relationship to the human mind as functions of discourse, as he argues. Indeed, it's notable that the principles, his principles of human understanding, should give a special attention to the relationship of ideas. Now, in Berkeley's ontology, we have to distinguish between ideas and spirits and relations. Spirits are the active agents of reality, whereas ideas are entirely passive. But following a definite Ramist understanding, he views the task of philosophy as being to gauge the kind of metaphysical agreement or disagreement between ideas. And we'll see this term agreement coming up in a few minutes as well. In methodical fashion, and for Ramis, method was absolutely paramount. Logic is really constructing a chain of ideas and conforming your mind to chains of ideas. And again, it resonates with Cartesianism, but it resonates with Ramism, which arguably lay behind these ideas as well. Like Ramis and others, Berkeley definitely understands these relationships as real. So there's a whole network of real relationships connecting things into this massive, even kind of infinite network of signification, known ultimately to God, but also reflected in our minds. Now, for Berkeley, idealism is Christian philosophy. From the principles, it's clear that his main reason for attacking the existence of matter is to refute the materialism which seeks to treat the world independently of God and which was on the rise, especially with deism. Again and again, he insists that the task of true philosophy is to promote true religion. And he also shares with Ramis and others a strong anti-Aristotelian current. In fact, he holds that due to their wedding to Aristotelian and scholastic notions of abstraction, there's been very little advancement in the sciences over the centuries. So Berkeley sees idealism as a path to reforming metaphysics, mathematics, physics, and all of the other sciences, something which links with his own his later encyclopedic and even Trinitarian treatment of reality in his controversial Cyrus work. In fact, Berkeley says in Ramist and Neoplatonic fashion, and this also does connect some of his alchemical interests, the goal is to uncover the analogies, harmonies, and agreements which connect all of the works together, of nature together, and to reduce them to general rules which allow very probable conjectures about things. And the more he does this, he thinks, the more we will come and approach to a sort of endeavor towards omniscience. And this drive towards a human omniscience was very much characteristic of the Ramists, of their encyclopedic ventures, especially of someone called Jan Amos Comenius. Also, there's a looking backwards. Berkeley wants to recover in a kind of pristine perfection as much as possible, this Edenic drive of Christian philosophy. He says if we could draw back or draw the curtain of words, then we'd finally gain a clear view of the ideas constituting reality, and the fairest tree of knowledge would be within our grasp. So turning to young Edwards, writing in The Mind, his kind of undergraduate and postgraduate notebook, Edwards had the following words of praise for the logic that he'd been taught at Yale. One reason, he said, why before I knew other logic, I used to be mightily pleased with the study of the old logic, was because it was very pleasant to see my thoughts that before lay in my mind jumbled without any distinction, ranged into order and distributed into classes and subdivisions, that I could tell where they all belonged and run them up to their general heads. For this logic consisted much in distributions and definitions, and their maxims gave occasion to observe new and strange dependencies of ideas and a seeming agreement of multitudes of them in the same thing that I never observed before. Now here it's very clear that these key distinctors of the old logic admired by Edwards are all those characteristic of Ramism. They also reflect something of the Cartesian logic of Port Royal, which was prominent at the time, but much of this also had a heritage in Ramism. The process of arranging and classifying ideas according to their various classes and subdivisions was really the bread and butter of what Ramist logic was about. And his suggestions of running up his thoughts to general heads suggests his facility with the Ramist processes of analysis and genesis, in which things or passages of the Bible, whole logical discourses were broken down into their component ideas and then built back up again. Particularly interesting is Edwards' suggestion that the old logic, Ramism, we could say, revealed both the dependencies of ideas and even their agreement in a single thing. Now, Edwards' quote reveals an assumption that Daniel also points out. The logic is intended to reveal the metaphysical anatomy of things themselves. Indeed, the notion of the dependency of ideas echoes the American encyclopedist Samuel Johnson, who was Edwards' tutor at Yale. And the notion of agreement, which we saw in Berkeley, the agreement of ideas, is a reminder of what Ramus called the constantaneous or constantaneity, the agreement of logical arguments. In fact, Ramus himself had pointed out how in logic, multiple ideas could agree within the same thing, the very same thing. And as I've argued elsewhere, for Richardson in New England and Harvard, and most explicitly in Henry Moore's Enchiridion Metaphysicum, a textbook taught at Yale, which turns out to be surprisingly steeped in Ramism, this doctrine became expressed in terms of Scotus's formal distinction, according to which different ideas or different definitions can exist within the very same thing. And so it's striking that Raposa has connected Edwards to the theosemiotics of Scotus. We also find echoes of this Scotist formal distinction in Edwards' wrestling with issues of realism and nominalism, which were so prominent in philosophy at the time, as they have been for centuries. While he insists that genus and species, so say the genus of animal and the species of a rational animal or human, is a kind of mental thing, he then immediately caveats this, saying, in a sense, nature has distributed things into species without or outside our minds. So while he does say, he is a nominalist, if you like, he does say universals have no existence outside of a human mind, so universal like humanity or whiteness or dogness, they do still have a reality in the mind of God expressed in the natural connection of ideas. And he goes into various arguments about how we can distinguish these ideas. So like contemporary Ramists, he's clearly fascinated with the dependency of ideas and the way they can inhere within a single thing and be used to argue for all kinds of other things. Now, returning again to the mind, which is probably the work in where we see the Ramist influence most clearly, Edwards holds that truth may be defined metaphysically as the consistency and agreement of our ideas with the mind of God. Note that term agreement again. This, he says, is equivalent to saying more ordinarily the agreement of ideas with things as they are. Now, interestingly, Edwards' definitions parallel verbatim someone like Alexander Richardson. And Edwards does say truth as to external things is the consistency of our ideas with those ideas or that train and series of ideas raised in our minds according to God's stated order and law, or according to the order of nature. For Edwards, such a claim follows naturally from his idealist position that corporeal things exist no otherwise than mentally. And so these Ramist Ramist notions, Ramist concepts are definitely leading him to play around with idealism in his early years. And in fact, it goes well beyond the scope of this paper. There are a lot of channels in which the New England curriculum, the Yale curriculum, can be linked to Ramism, not least his tutor, Samuel Johnson, who I mentioned. And so from all these claims, there was a small step to seeing the whole world as a system of ideas in the mind of God. I think eloquently expressed this. Yes, there must be an universal attraction in the whole system of things, from the beginning of the world to the end. And to speak more strictly and metaphysically, we must say, in the whole system and series of ideas in all created minds. So these things must necessarily be put in to make complete the system of the ideal world. That is, they must be supposed, if the train of ideas be in the order and course settled by the supreme mind. So we may answer in short, this is the important bit, that the existence of these things is in God's supposing of them in order to render complete the series of ideas and the harmony of things. Now, this passage from ideas and dependency to a system of ideas and then to the world as reflecting this system of ideas in the mind of God, there are important Ramist kind of steps, milestones along that route. Now, I've mentioned this term consanguinity or agreement, and Edwards found that in various Ramist and Ramist-influenced figures. And as Daniels argued, it was also at the heart of Edwards' celebrated definition of excellency or beauty as the consent of being to being. For it's this notion of consent or agreement which expresses Edwards' fundamental conviction that all of being is relational. As Scott Fennemar has argued, there are also many intriguing parallels between the young Edwards and Berkeley. Now, for a long time, Edwards thought that Edwards only read Berkeley quite late and he couldn't have shaped his early idealist writings, but Fennemar goes into a great deal of analysis of the various periodicals and things Edwards read to prove pretty convincingly that he had direct exposure to Berkeley almost from the beginning. And all of these parallels is not something that Fennemar says, but all of them attain a particular resonance when we consider them within their shared Ramist heritage. So Edwards shares with Berkeley a focus on our intuitive grasp of reality. In fact, even more so, he frequently talks about our intellectual sight directly perceiving ideas. He prioritizes our sense of vision and builds on that inference that as colors are not really in things, but only in the mind, so we can extrapolate this to all kinds of other sensible qualities and eventually to matter itself. And inspired by Berkeley, Edwards deconstructs Locke's distinction of primary and secondary qualities, which were acting as a kind of barrier to a fully fledged idealism. Now, Berkeley famously wrote about when his famous example is that when he was in his study at his desk, he perceived the existence of his table. If he left the room, he said it would still exist because if he came back into the room, he would still find it, or because another spirit or because God was continually perceiving it. And as Fennemar points out, this parallels directly Edwards, who argues, it may be asked, how do those things exist which have an actual existence, but of which no created mind is conscious. For instance, the furniture of this room, when we are absent and the room is shut up and no created mind perceives it, how do these things exist? We may answer in short that the existence of these things is in God's supposing of them. In fact, Edwards is a bit more emphatic than Berkeley on God's direct observation, interestingly. So for Edwards, all existence is perception, and this mirrors Berkeley's essay Est Percipi, as Fennemar points out. It's also clear, and more should be said about this, that for Edwards, as for Berkeley, idealism clearly represents the true Christian philosophy and the goal at which Ramism had itself been aiming. Edwards expresses a desire to write a natural history of the mental world and to explore all the parallelisms of the internal and external world. And here we find this kind of project of the rational account transposed into a new idealist key. So turning from Berkeley to Leibniz, in an entry written towards the end of his life in his typological notebook, Edwards records his great enthusiasm for the emblematic theology of the 18th century German theologian Johann Friedrich Stapfer. Drawing on Stapfer's account of the wonderful harmony between the visible and spiritual world, and his conviction that the world of visible existence is a mirror of the divine attributes, he also records his citation of the most elegant but very brief account Leibniz offers of this. And this is quoting Leibniz. This depth is concealed in the testimony of divine wisdom or in the hidden God, and hidden in the universal harmony of things. The treasure of the corporeal world more and more shows us its elegance in this life by the light of nature itself. While the systems of macrocosm and microcosm begin to be revealed by discoveries of modern writers. But the most excellent part of things, the city of God, is a spectacle whose beauty will at last come closer to understanding when we're illuminated by the light of divine glory. The end of the quote. Captured in one quote here, we have that sweeping Leibnizian vision of the universal harmony of things, rooted in God, displayed in the emanation or unfolding of the macrocosm and microcosm, and extending throughout the whole sphere of history into the eschatological future of the world and the city of God. Now, in what follows, I want to trace out just briefly Leibniz's account of this universal harmony, as it was known to Edwards, both through his reading of Stapfer, a theologian deeply influenced by Leibniz, in the late 1640s, early 1650s, and through his direct reading of the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, which he read before he wrote his famous Freedom of the Will, or during his writing of it. And I want to highlight an important Trinitarian and harmonious dimension to this idealism. As Stapfer's quote suggests, Leibniz's account of universal harmony is grounded in Neoplatonism and idealism. And Leibniz loved to recur to what he called a beautiful passage from Plato's Phaedo, which held that intelligent being is the cause of all things. And indeed, Leibniz held from Plato and other Platonists that all substances depend on God, just as our thoughts emanate from our minds. Indeed, Leibniz even suggested that God produces substances continually by kind of emanation from the divine mind, something that Berkeley was also interested in, and indeed Edwards, really. Now, for Leibniz, this emanational metaphysics flowers his celebrated account of possible worlds, and this theme was found very prominently in Stapfer. It's well definitely known to Edwards. A possible world described by Stapfer is a system of interconnected ideas in the mind of God. For Leibniz, as for Duns Scotus, possibility was expressed as non-repugnance to being. And extending this logic, Leibniz held that a possible world is constituted by complete and compossible series of individuals, so individuals who are compatible with each other, don't contradict each other. And so he extends this kind of combinatorial reasoning about possibility, which he could have gained from Scotus, into a really kind of full-fledged view of possible worlds. Now, for Leibniz, there were an infinite series of possible worlds, out of which God chose to actually one. Our world is the only world that exists. In his theodicy, he imagines these as representing an infinite library in the mind of God, as recorded in the Book of Fates. And here again, we have that Ramist kind of propositional view of reality. And in fact, Leibniz does seem to view possible worlds as a set of propositions in the mind of God. So God chooses out of these infinite number of possible worlds. And it was key for Leibniz, this is his famous principle of sufficient reason, that God must have a reason to choose one world over another. And what's very interesting is that he characterizes this in terms that echo with Ramism as the fitness or convenience that each of these worlds possesses, which also kind of quantifies its degree of perfection. So in creating the world, God surveys an infinite set of possible worlds and chooses out of them. Now, Leibniz held that the will of God is determined to a choice which is best without absolutely necessitating the will. So the will of God always has a choice, a metaphysical choice, a possibility of different actions, but God is necessitated also to choose the best, and this was important to him. And he expressed this in what he called moral necessity, the obligation for God to follow the strongest inclination of his nature, which is always to do the best, and which is a kind of freedom of excellence. Now, importantly, Leibniz sees the choice of possible worlds made by God as a dynamic interaction of his power, wisdom, and goodness. So the actual existence of the best that wisdom makes known to God is due to this, that his goodness makes him choose it, and his power makes him produce it. Now, this focus on power, wisdom, and goodness, we'll see it again in a minute, was something that Leibniz took from Tommaso Campanella, the Italian Renaissance Neoplatonist, who held that all of being dynamically mirrors the Trinity through power, wisdom, and goodness, which are infused in all of being and which are present in the Trinity itself. And it was a view that had deep Franciscan roots. Indeed, Campanella has some echoes of Scotus here. But what's significant is Leibniz's use of this triad means that there is an implicit dynamic Trinitarian imprint evident not only on the infinite possible worlds in the mind of God, but also in the world that God creates. And this is where we come to Leibniz's really kind of famous but controversial monadology. So we see this in the account of the monads, or simple substances that God creates, which for Leibniz are the building blocks of all of reality. For him, all compound or complex substances consist of combinations of an infinite number of monads. Indeed, he draws on a kind of Ramistic picture in which every portion of matter is compared to a branch of a plant. But the closer you get to that branch, the more you see that it branches out infinitely into more and more divisions. So even in the smallest particle of matter, there's a world of creatures, living beings, souls, monads, he says. And this branching chart was a way that Ramism kind of pictured graphically his logic. Reinforcing his idealism, Leibniz held that matter has no separate existence of its own, but is a kind of epiphenomenon of these infinite monadic combinations, like a rainbow refracted from an infinite set of drops of water. Now, this view has often puzzled commentators, but Leibniz was able to justify it because he held that there are no created substances wholly destitute of matter. In this, he said, he followed the ancients in holding that angels, intelligences, and souls all have subtle bodies despite being incorporeal. This was actually a Neoplatonic view, represented especially by a Franciscan account of what was called metaphysical or spiritual matter, which was made famous by the works of Bonaventure, whom Thomas Leinkauf has revealed as a major source for Leibniz's metaphysics. Indeed, it's also interesting that Jean-Pascal Onfray has recently argued that for Leibniz, the spiritual form and matter that each monad possesses are formally distinct. So a monad is a simple substance, it's one thing, but it's composed of form and matter, and this means that the form and matter are formally distinct. Now, very intriguingly, we also find Richard Baxter, a Puritan and Ramist theologian, earlier, I don't think Leibniz would have known this, but earlier, playing around with exactly these same notions. In his monadology, Leibniz also hints at the Trinitarian imprint on each monad. And here he draws on Campanella again to argue that every monad has an inchoate perception and appetite within it, which mirrors the triune power, wisdom, and goodness of God imprinted on all things. Moreover, since Leibniz also holds that each monad expresses the mind of God, each monad actually realizes the universe and the mind of God from its own limited and individual perspective. It follows that each monad, each simple substance, has relations, which express all the others, and consequently, each monad is a perpetual living mirror of the universe. And actually here, as well as elsewhere, Leibniz is very close to Nicholas of Cusa, who also had this kind of perspectival metaphysics. But as much as this is a Neoplatonic or Cusan vision of reality, it's also clearly a Ramist vision, redolent of Berkeley, in which every being is characterized by its relations such that the whole world becomes expressed as a relational system of ideas. And it's this which becomes the root of Leibniz's famous pre-established harmony. Each monad is such that the following state is a consequence of the preceding one. This means that God need only make a monad the representation of the universe from its own point of view, and then it will automatically follow, at least Leibniz holds that it will automatically follow, that everything else is in harmony, everything else kind of falls into place, arranges itself around each monad. And in fact, the soul for Leibniz is a dominant monad. It's a single monad which governs all the infinity of monads composing the human body. It's a living mirror of the universe, but it's also an image of God, capable of imitating him. And for Leibniz, it's this metaphysical harmony which becomes the ground of the personal harmony or the fellowship between God and humans, where God is not only like an inventor to a machine, but is like a prince to his subjects, or much more a father to his children. In this way, Leibniz says, the totality of all spirits must compose the city of God. And it's this truly universal monarchy, which is the moral world in the natural world. It's also the supreme pinnacle of creation and the highest expression of the triune power, wisdom, and goodness of God. The result of this harmony, he says, is that things lead to grace by the very ways of nature. Very interesting, kind of provocative statement. So what's the relevance of all this for Edwards? Now, of course, much more work needs to be done to reconstruct exactly how much Edwards would have known of this vision, but it's clear through Stapfer and the Leibniz-Clark correspondence that definite important aspects would have been known to him. Now, at first sight, Leibniz's vision of universal harmony with its exotic kind of monadology may seem a far cry from Edwards, but as we look closer, we find some truly striking parallels due to their shared Ramist, and I would also say ultimately Franciscan metaphysical heritage. The roots of Edwards' own Trinitarian idealism are early. They're found in his work, The Mind, in which he argues that the infinite love and delight that the Father and Son have for each other is the infinite beauty of the Holy Spirit and is expressed in God's infinite consent to being in general. Again, this notion that Daniel highlights as Ramist of the consent of being to being. Significantly, he also suggests that God's love for his creatures is to be understood as his own self-communication. So creation becomes shot through with the inner dynamism of the Trinity. And as is well known, this kind of unfolded into a fully fledged Trinitarian metaphysics. In fact, rather like Leibniz and Berkeley, Edwards clearly seems to assume a kind of univocal relationship of the human mind to the divine mind, so we can make direct maps between the two. And for Edwards, by a complex route linked very much to his idealism, this leads to the claim that the Son should be seen as the idea in the mind of God, the idea that encompasses everything that God is, and is a kind of repetition of the being of the Father. And the Holy Spirit is the love that unites the two. Of course, this is not a new idea, but Edwards expressed this kind of Augustinian idea in a new Enlightenment idiom. And for Edwards, the Trinity also becomes expressed in his account of real attributes. According to this, there are no other real distinctions in God that can be thought of, save that of God, his idea, and his love. What this means is that the three distinct real things in God and everything else that can be mentioned is nothing but mere modes or relations of existence. Evidence elsewhere shows that Edwards correlates the Father with power, the Son with wisdom, and the Holy Spirit with goodness and love. Now, this again is not unusual, but we have just seen this triad in Leibniz. But Edwards goes further. He actually holds that the Father is identified with power, the Son with wisdom, and the Holy Spirit with love, even to the point that the Father should be said to understand through the Son, and the Father and the Son should be understood to love through the Holy Spirit. And this was a notion conceiving the divine persons as absolute properties rather than relations. This could be traced back to Scotus again, and it's very present, interestingly, in the Ramists, Alsted, and also especially Richard Baxter, who I suspect is probably Edwards' source for this. And again, we therefore have that kind of Franciscan triad of power, wisdom, and goodness actually characterizing, identifying the persons of the Trinity. Reinforcing this kind of Franciscan understanding, and this is probably also something that Edward got through the Catholic philosopher Nicholas Malebranche, the outward emanation of creation parallels the inner emanation of the Trinity. And in this account, like Bonaventure, Edward gives a major role to Christ as the hinge between the inner and outer emanations of God. As he says, why then did God incline further to communicate himself, seeing he had done so infinitely and completely in the generation of the Son? To this I say, the Son has also an inclination to communicate himself in an image of his person that may partake of his happiness, and that was the end of creation and the only motive here too. So the creation is a kind of communication and emanation almost of the Son. In Ramism and Neoplatonic fashion, Edwards held, much like Leibniz, that all of reality emanated from God and returned to him. As he famously put this in his end, for which God created the world, a disposition in God as an original property of his nature to an emanation of his own infinite fullness was what excited him to create the world. And so that the emanation itself was aimed at by him as the last end of his creation. So emanation connecting the origins of the world to its final goal and last end. In a manner resonating again with the branching diagrams of the Ramist, he also compares the whole universe to a tree, holding that the disposition there is in the root and stock of a tree to diffuse sap and life. And this is doubtless the reason of their communication to its buds, leaves, and fruits after these exist. The whole of creation thus bears the Trinitarian imprint of God's power, wisdom, and goodness, and this is borne out by others of Edwards' works. Notably, also, we find for Edwards that same Trinitarian harmony of the macrocosm and microcosm, which so attracted him in Stapfer and later in Leibniz. As he expressed this, every atom in the universe is managed by Christ so as to be most to the advantage of the Christian. Every particle of air, every ray of the sun, so that when he in the other world, when he comes to see it, shall sit and enjoy this vast inheritance with surprising, amazing joy, that famous ascetic appreciation of Edwards. Now, Edwards' atomism is evident from his earliest idealist writings and is very much influenced by people like Henry Moore. Significantly, as William Newman has argued, Ramism also played an important role in shaping American atomism in Harvard in the 17th century. And we find also at Harvard prominent interest in Franciscan theories of metaphysical matter, such as the one that we referred to in Leibniz. So while he probably lacks or does lack the panpsychism of Leibniz, the kind of inchoate perception and appetite or mind in every atom, every spiritual atom, Edwards does espouse a kind of spiritual atomism and a kind of pre-established harmony in which all atoms and their motion become seen as expression of divine power, wisdom, and goodness. And in his freedom of the will, Edwards is also, and this is a theme I can't go into very much, but Edwards affirms a universal determining providence which determines the best choice from a whole series of possible consequences. Indeed, although Edwards doesn't quite reach Leibniz's possible worlds, he clearly conceives the world as a set of possible interconnection of ideas. And like Leibniz, he holds that God necessarily but freely wills to institute a world. And indeed, Edwards is clear, as Leibniz is clear, that this world is the best of all possible worlds, despite the fact that it has sin, because God sees the sin but uses the sin to make something incomparably better. Briefly, in conclusion, I also want to just touch on the way that the whole of history for Edwards bears a dynamic stamp of the Trinity. And this is something evident from his history of the work of redemption, a series of sermons he preached in the midst of the Northampton revivals, which he desired to turn into a body of divinity in an entire new method, as he put it, being thrown into the form of a history, a project forestalled by his sudden and untimely death. Now, in an important letter to the trustees at Princeton University, he expressed his ambitious desire in this projected work to trace the entire history of all three worlds of heaven, earth, and hell, from their origin in eternity through to the final consummation of all things. In this, his goal was to consider the connected successive events and alterations in each, introducing all parts of divinity in that order which is most scriptural and most natural. Such a method, he suggests, is most beautiful and entertaining and reveals the admirable contexture and harmony of the whole. And from his notebooks for this work, we know he intended to draw deeply on Stapfer, and that kind of quote I began with about the parallels between our world and the ideal world was something that was important to him in conceiving this history of the work of redemption. Now, again, I can't really enter to demonstrate this, but Edwards' history of the work of redemption might well be the last great Ramist system of theology. But as the editor of it, John Wilson, suggests, the sermons on the history of the work of redemption, which were the basis for what he intended as a developed system, are all structured according to an intricate nested set of Ramist and logical divisions. In fact, this was fairly standard for the New England preaching even in the 18th century. Also, though, there's an implicit Trinitarian dynamism and harmony here. For Edwards, the work of redemption is one in which all the persons of the Trinity do conspire, and all the various dispensations that belong to it, he says, are united as the several wheels in one machine to answer one end and produce one effect. Indeed, speaking of Christ as foretold from age to age and shadowed forth in a vast variety of types and figures, he holds that all the great wheels of providence from one age to another all tend hither. And echoing a common Franciscan and Neoplatonic trope, he holds that Christ is the center on which all the providential lines of history, if they could be observed and accurately followed, converge. Edwards' notebooks for the history of work of redemption make clear his intention to draw extensively on his miscellanies, another notebook for the material of this grand work. And notably in the miscellanies, we find an implicit Trinitarian understanding of the working of the wheels of providence, a biblical image that he took, of course, from Ezekiel. In this, Edward pictures the whole creation and not only the workings of providence as a kind of living machine made up of a series of interconnected wheels. Since he says the highest end of any creature is to be useful to the common good, it follows that God created the world so the parts could be mutually useful to each other, as in a clock where every part is necessary to the working of the whole. But such a view for him doesn't efface the hierarchical ordering of reality. Rather, there's an intermediate communication, he says, between one degree of being and another, such that every wheel immediately communicates with the next wheel. There's kind of hierarchy of wheels, and at the topmost of this pinnacle of being is God himself. And Edwards chides those who would dismiss this kind of enthusiastic discussion as talking those people who dismiss it are talking very unphilosophically. Now, such a view of creation is clearly Neoplatonic. It echoes Comenius, as mentioned. It echoes Leibniz, who in the monadology describes the world as a living machine. What's interesting also is that for Edwards, the four divine things that turn the wheels of providence and that manage all things are nothing other than the divine attributes of wisdom, power, goodness, and justice. In this way, the harmonious interlocking of the wheels of providence expressed in the history of the work of redemption reveals the dynamic imprint of the Trinity. And perhaps mediated through Alsted, it also reveals the kind of combinatorial understanding of reality, thoroughly redolent of Leibniz, but also, as we saw, of Berkeley. As in Leibniz, this vision also culminates in a Trinitarian vision of the Church. In fact, Edwards recounts the eschatological future of the world as expressed in the growing infinite conformity of creatures to God. As he puts it, the more the divine communications increase in the creature, the more it becomes one with God. In this, the elect creature, viewed as the end of all the rest of creation, is brought home, centered on God, and as it were, swallowed up in him. Strongly mystical language here as well. Over the whole of eternity, he says, this develops into an infinitely perfect conformity of creatures to God, coming nearer and nearer, but never reaching that union between the Father and the Son. So creation is progressively and infinitely in heaven, mirroring more and more the union of the Father and the Son. But Edwards, as for Leibniz, the goal of all things is therefore the progressive conforming of them to the life and being of the Trinity. It's this which was the living spirit animating the Franciscan and the Ramist reformation of method, as expressed anew at the dawn of the Enlightenment. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much. So we've got some people online, so I'm looking with one eye on the screen to see if people have got questions immediately there. And I'm also looking around the table. You're obviously here, but so there's basically Barry on this side. But I'm open to questions from either place. If anyone has one or one is through it, show yourself at least willing to ask.
So the last one.
Yes, there's Bill. Bill's first.
Okay. Thank you so much, Simon. That was so interesting. I was wondering if you could just clarify one small thing for me that I may have missed. So did Edwards hold an idea of spiritual matter?
That's a good question. That's something I've been thinking about, but I think in a sense, yes, because matter doesn't actually exist. So everything exists are ideas. So what we call matter must have an ideal constitution. Now, interestingly, it's really interesting to me how Edwards and Berkeley were able to kind of hold this view, which seemed very strange, and they were aware it was strange, and lots of people at the time were saying this is just ridiculous. But also from within it, preserve all of our experience of the world, including the difference between body and soul. But it must be a kind of metaphysical or spiritual matter. I haven't been able to trace how far Edwards was aware of that tradition. Leibniz definitely was aware of it. Richard Baxter was very much aware of it, and a metaphysician called Francis Glisson and Richard Krakenthorpe, who were taught in Oxford or were in England in the 17th century, who may well have been on the Yale curriculum, at least one of them. So it was percolating, the notion. And I think Edwards is committed actually to a kind of spiritual atomism. Leibniz doesn't like atomism because he thinks the world is infinitely divisible. Every kind of stage you get at, there's always another branching of the tree of reality. Edwards actually also thinks that things are infinitely divisible, but he kind of thinks that this could still be packaged up in kind of atoms. Kind of atomism, even though things are still divisible further, at least by the power of God. So, yeah, really, thanks. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Maybe if I can just connect to that as well, but let me first start to say I really appreciate your paper because I'm mostly reading modern realism and critical realism or constructivism, and going back to idealism is again pleasant to remind, especially my own history when I started reading Plato, and I was very much all into idealism. So thank you for bringing all of this back again to me. But just two things maybe to connect to the previous question about spirit within atoms. And while you were discussing Leibniz, I was wondering about the word panpsychism, and then you mentioned it towards the end.
Yes.
So this is just my one comment I want to make, how this panpsychism is actually kind of reviving at the moment. More and more people, and especially in Scotland, there's strong academics arguing in the philosophy of mind content.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Panpsychism. And to some extent, it does make sense to me. So So I just want to say that, but I want to go back to idealism and the influence of Berkeley upon Edwards. And I was just wondering, when you also talked about everything in God's mind, and rather turning towards God and to appreciate what is happening in his mind, etc., whether there was any influence from Plotinus.
Oh, that's right. On Berkeley or on?
Well, I mean, in that whole tradition, because
yes, definitely. Yes, I think that's something I have to look into. And Daniels tends to see Berkeley as more Stoic, but there has been work on Berkeley, obviously, as a Platonist, and and linking him to people like Ficino and Pico, so that would be at least an indirect appreciation of Plotinus. But I suspect, and I'd have to check, that in early 18th century Dublin there'd be some direct exposure to that as well. But that's a really interesting question. I mean, Leibniz is citing Plato directly. I have to check about Berkeley. Yeah, that's great. That's interesting. But Berkeley was also very interested in alchemy, apparently, which is something that's come out recently, and more Reformed and other figures do seem to be interested in alchemy when you start digging into it. Because partly it was the science of the time, and partly because it was linked to this sort of Neoplatonic vision of reality that they found attractive and could encompass within their Christian philosophy. So even William Ames seems to admit the theoretical possibility of alchemy, and it was taught at Harvard in the 17th century, and they also had chemistry labs there, and others like Robert Boyle, who are also in this world very much interested in alchemy.
I assume Newton read more on that than on
Newton had a direct link with New England alchemy. George Starkey was an influence. He was trained at Harvard and then came over to England. And some of these figures, admittedly, are certainly very eccentric, but there is also interest within the mainstream. So things like alchemy and panpsychism weren't necessarily as strange as they might seem when you kind of reconstruct the current genealogies of Reformed kind of scholasticism, with a strong emphasis on Aristotelianism and medieval currents, and much less on Platonic and other sort of currents.
I think I'll include that in the new HTC fundraising strategy.
Yeah, well, I was a theologian who try and turn lead into gold.
Can I ask a follow-up? It's just to clarify that point that you raised, and due to my ignorance, I didn't really understand you commented early on that that most scholars read this discussion of Ramism in the light of Stoicism.
Yes.
But you are for a Platonic
Yes.
view. Can you just define the difference? What's
that's a very good question. I think the link with Stoicism is definitely real. It's made because Ramus was a commentator on Cicero, and so he was very influenced by Stoicism. And the Stoic form of logic is something I need to look into more because I've worked more on the Platonic side. But the Stoic form of logic is based on propositions and the way that propositions function and are kind of arranged in logical discourse, whereas the Aristotelian system is based on terms. I guess the Platonic system is maybe more a kind of dialectic of ideas, which gets taken up in Ramism.
okay?
But yeah, I need some more precision on that. I think Daniel suggests that the key thing for him in Stoicism is this kind of semiotic view of reality, and the view that propositions, not substances or things, are the things that actually exist. I think there are actually roots into making that claim through Platonism, and I think that within both the medieval and the 17th century context, Platonism and Stoicism were often kind of mutually informing.
Sure.
It's quite interesting that at the end of Freedom of the Will, when Edwards is being accused of holding a Stoic view of fate, he actually says, I'm quite happy with the Stoics, they were the closest to the Christian philosophers.
Sure.
So he takes out the Christian Stoicism, even perhaps more than the Christian Platonism there. Whereas Leibniz is keen to defend himself against the charge that he's holding to a Stoic form of faith.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's great to
Yeah,
see you
yeah.
again.
Yeah, hi Simon, hi all. Thank you for this brilliant talk. And my question and comment is on it is a sort of follow up to what we were discussing in Wroclaw, or what my paper in Wroclaw was about.
Yes.
Yeah, the question, the Christological question of the body of Christ, and
Yes.
it's conceiving in idealism, because
Yes.
I tried to show that Leibniz was not an idealist or Platonist in the sense that he had this unity of matter and form, you know, this vinculum substantiale, this that it makes sense to speak about the body of Christ because the body is always in unity with the mind. Yeah, so it is not a sort of Berkeleyan subjective idealism. But as far as I know about Berkeley, and what I also got to know from your talk about Edwards, how do Berkeley and Edwards conceive the body of Christ in all its meanings?
That's a really very great question. Thank you, and that's something I should think about more. Yes, I think that's really important to point out, and I should have made that a bit clearer. That actually Edwards and Berkeley are kind of whole hog idealists, or fully fledged idealists, whereas Leibniz, as I understand, maybe a bit more like Malebranche, matter doesn't have an independent existence, but it's like that epiphenomenon of the monad. So is that right, or is that?
I would say it is more Aristotelian than Malebranche in Leibniz. Yeah,
Okay,
it is really a try to reconcile Aristotle and the substantial forms
that makes sense.
and its unity with matter with
but it's
Cartesianism.
Definitely not the same as Edwards and Berkeley. It doesn't go to that kind of extreme. I think that's a good point. Actually, Berkeley, interestingly, and I have to try and follow this up to see if he ever did this, in his Principles of Human Understanding, he suggests that idealism could provide a very good defense of the resurrection and the resurrection body of Christ. So he's quite open to conceiving Christ's body in terms of this idealist framework, but sadly, at least there, he doesn't give any examples. I'm not aware whether Edwards does ever use his idealism to explore either Eucharistic or Christological questions. That would be really interesting. what I understand he does do is he uses it to explore the question of original sin, and people have written on this more recently. And actually, Edwards takes up Stapfer and what was even called Stapfer's scheme to argue that it's not just that Adam's sin is imputed to us, but that we actually commit Adam's sin, all of us individually commit Adam's sin for ourselves, because God is able to include us because personal identity is sort of ideal or connected to a series of ideal things that are linked together by God. God is able to kind of transplant us into the ideal identity of Adam himself.
But that's extreme nominalism, isn't it? That in some sense, kind of the reality is in individuals, which then create the universal, not with the universal humanity, which is then participated in by.
Yes,
So,
yes.
So it's a nominalist thing rather than a Platonist.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing because people have interpreted Ramism as nominalism, and you do find Ramists who are very interested in nominalism, and certainly Edwards and Berkeley can be classified as nominalists.
Mm.
But you also find quite a lot of Ramists like Alexander Richardson and William Ames who are Scotists and who hold that there is real existence of universal natures and they're reflected as ideas in the mind of God. And there is a kind of tension in Ramism, I think, which can sometimes, I would tend to associate it more with the Platonic realist view, but in this kind of, maybe especially in this Enlightenment phase of Ramism, as it was turning into idealism, or at least that's my argument, or as Ramism was contributing to the birth of idealism, that kind of nominalist undercurrent does come out more and more. And interestingly, Berkeley, although he's kind of, although he castigates the schoolmen, in some places he does mention his kind of acquaintance and interest in later medieval theologians and kind of later medieval occasionalists and nominalists. So there is that kind of undercurrent in some Ramists, but not all, I would say.
And if you were taking the project back further, would you go as far back as Abelard? Who thinks of God as power of wisdom and love?
Do you want me to extend the long Reformation back? Yeah. I mean, definitely quite a lot of Reformed interest in someone like Hughes and Victor.
Right.
And if they're not reading Bonaventure directly, although they often can be, they're certainly reading Hughes and Victor, and some of this is coming, like in Alsted is citing Hughes and Victor. I think he is reading Bonaventure definitely as well. Abelard, that's really interesting. That someone did make a link between Abelard and Richard Baxter in the triad of power, wisdom, and goodness. And Abelard has that, doesn't he? Does he? And he does actually identify, because Baxter discusses this kind of Victorine and Abelardian debates about the persons of the Trinity and the attributes of the Trinity. So yeah, I guess I would definitely extend it to 12th century Renaissance. Although if I write something, I'm not sure I will extend it to. I've got another project trying to trace this from Bonaventure and Scotus forwards, and I will strongly resist the temptation to add a chapter on the 12th century Renaissance. But I think it is rooted in 12th century, and more scholarship on people like Nicholas of Cusa is showing how Cusa is very much drawing on ideas of 12th century Renaissance, which he was familiar with, and reading manuscripts of people like Thierry of Chartres and others. So how much Abelard, though, I think might be overdue for more study in this regard. I think Courtney has done some things on parallels between Ockham and Abelard and that kind of thing, but not in this other context. No. Yeah, okay. Not this Trinitarian context. Yeah.
So Musgrave, you'd be very patient. Question?
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for that. I've got two questions for you. First, it was fascinating that you kept referring to light theory and the color spectrum. I was curious just how influential Newton's still recent publication on the nature of light and color spectrum was on Berkeley's Idealism. And the second question would be with reference to God's perceiving of possible worlds and choosing. Would that be where someone like Edwards would then begin to articulate that choice in terms of what we have in Genesis 1, God speaking forth. I'm just curious, because if something cannot exist except it is supposed by God, then where does the supposing then translate into speaking?
Yeah. Gosh. Light and Newton. That's something I need to look into. I think, yes, Berkeley no doubt was very influenced by Newton, and he draws on him in the principles. He doesn't like his idea of absolute space, and he doesn't like Henry Moore's idea, which almost certainly influenced Newton, which was to compare God with infinite space. And so he does like Newton a lot, and he's very interested in Newton, especially his physics and mathematics. He takes up the idea that gravity is the will of God, which Newton kind of cautiously expressed in the middle of the Leibniz-Clarke debate. So yes, Newton's really present. I have to look at his theory of light. At least in the Ramists, I would associate that much more with that Franciscan Neoplatonic. But by the time you get to Berkeley, Newton is clearly very important. And Newton is hugely important to Edwards as well. He mentions in Freedom of the Will kind of Newton's theory of gravity. And if we had two atoms on an individual path, there was a gravitational force from the other side of the universe that just slightly perturbed one of these atoms, then the whole history of the world could have been different, which is why, this whole complex interconnected series of possible worlds or events is something that God must know. So there is a kind of mechanical, deterministic aspect of this, which Philip Fisk has nicely brought out. But I'm beginning to wonder, as I study this in Leibniz and Edwards, whether, at least in intention, there was much more preserving of the Scotist freedom of opposites and synchronic kind of alternatives, which the Reformed had held before. So the break might be less than people have said. But that's something I'm kind of pondering a bit at the moment.
Reminds me a bit of Pascal's Cleopatra's nose kind of thing. If Cleopatra's nose had been an inch shorter, the world history would have been different or something like that.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, there's that kind of similar kind of thing.
It's kind of almost what we talk about today is in terms of kind of chaos theory and the butterfly effect, isn't it? They were thinking about it in the framework of Newton's laws of gravity. So I'm not sure that even answers your question. The other question was on the speaking aspect.
Right.
I think for Alsted and others, this idea of reality as vocal, which Daniel and others have captured in this kind of semiotic or theosemiotic view, which is associated with Bonaventure and Scotus, but has very strong roots in that passage in Augustine when he interrogates creation, and this creation says, I'm not God, and speaks to him of God. I think this vocal view of reality is really key for Ramists. And for someone like Richardson, speech is actually encoded in being, so that logical, like things, as I say, they emanate their colours like light, but they also actually speak to us if we have the ears to kind of hear and logically discern their connections. So it's a very vocal, kind of luminous world, very much an enchanted world. This isn't a very disenchanted world. And definitely even in Edwards and Leibniz and Berkeley, it's really not a disenchanted world as far as I can tell.
Okay, anyone else online? Like with this question so far? We have another kind of 10 minutes maybe if we need to use it. Apart from Sam and Peter, I can't really see people's faces, so I'm not really sure whether people are looking thoughtful or whether they're being not thoughtful. So I'll turn to the room and see if there's any takers for final or questions.
This is just a very, I guess, a question of classification, and that Berkeley would often be classed amongst the British empiricists.
Yes.
And so how do you see the distinction between empiricism and idealism in Berkeley?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, I have to say that this is Enlightenment is still relatively new terrain to me. I got into it. Well, Leibniz, I was partly new to and Nicholas Cusa reflected him, and then as I started this kind of continuation of my projects on Ramism, I suddenly began to wonder about idealism. So I'm still learning a lot. I think my understanding is that both Edwards and Berkeley are very influenced by Locke and this view of kind of primary and secondary qualities, but they want to break that down, and so Locke is pointing them to sense perception and critiques of certain abstractions that Berkeley really dislikes abstractions. So there's a strong empirical stance. As we mentioned, he writes the new theory of vision. So vision and empirical kind of study of the world is kind of key to him. But at the same time, he's kind of pushing beyond that and pushing beyond Locke. And now there's no actual matter except as the kind of that has an independent existence outside of the human mind, or any existence outside the human mind. So yeah, and actually there has been some work on Locke and Platonism as well, which suggests that even Locke wasn't necessary, and not a bit on Locke and Ramism that suggests that Locke wasn't so far from these kind of some of these kind of intuitions, but maybe Berkeley pushed them further.
Yeah. But my understanding was that Berkeley was trying to take empiricism serious, because that's
yes.
as empiricist, but to counteract Locke's argument that it's not just the empirical reality, there's something, and therefore I think this whole idea of sensations is coming from a material world.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
but put it together, as you say, the touch is implanted by God.
Yes.
Idealism.
Yes.
Is the main step.
You kind of get to Platonism by the back door through empiricism when you follow Berkeley's reasoning. I
mean, there's Platonism in a strong sense of the intellect rather than the reason.
Yes.
The intellectual sphere is a spiritual sphere. It's a reality. It's high reality.
Yes.
In the way that Cartesian reason is not. It's an instrument to get things done and understand things and do things about. So that you can see that as an empiricism, because it believes in that an account of reality as it is. One needs to factor in so-called spiritual forces.
Yes.
I have one last question before you start. Nobody else wants to ask Sibo. Which is about Edward's quaternity, when you said he has wisdom, power, goodness, and in the fourth one, justice. Is that in the sense of distributing to those who do well or have faith one thing, or those who have unbelief another thing? Is it justice in that sense? Again, he feels like a good reform. He has to have something of that kind of in it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I'm trying to remember, but the justice and righteousness come up very early in the history of the work of redemption as well. And I can't remember which verse it is from Isaiah, but the whole 50 sermons was preached on a single, but to be honest, it soon really doesn't have that much to do with the verse it starts from. But righteousness and justice, maybe that's unfair. It probably does have more to do with it when you look into it, but not ostensibly. But anyway, righteousness and justice do feature quite prominently early on. So it's quite interesting to me that he is thinking of righteousness and justice, and he's also got his analogy of the wheels of providence. So I think he's still thinking about what he wrote in the miscellanies. But
that moral thing does seem quite important not just the. We don't just say, well, that's for something. We'll reserve that for something else. When we come on to talk about the doctrine of the atonement, then we'll bring in, justice or the character of God.
Yeah, and he has a throwaway comment, I think, at the end of the freedom of the will about how if we attend to all this, it will allow us to reconcile and universal redemption and limited atonement, and we can kind of hold both views and things. So, yeah. And his view of justification has been compared a bit like Richard Baxter. I think there's kind of, again, there are passages in there where it do speak very simply of justified by faith alone, but a bit like Baxter, he has this view of the kind of intrinsic dynamic of love within faith that can allow him to kind of merge faith and sanctification.
Yeah, right.
So there is a kind of maybe a reconciling strand that, like in Baxter. And I think Baxter might be a source for some important aspects in Edwards, as he's also been revealed to be a source for some aspects of Wesley as well.
Yeah.
On the image of different notions of the image of God seem to come from Richard Baxter.
Right. And I think what's that?
Yeah, Watts was very heavily, but when Edwards was writing against Watts in the funeral of the will, which is interesting. But is it Watts who has that hymn, Wisdom, Love, Might? Or is that late?
Wisdom, love, might.
So this triad
As
has,
if you like.
yeah, this triad was around, and actually there is an anti-Trinitarian, Stephen Nye, I think, who lifts large passages of Richard Baxter's, the reflections on power, wisdom, and love, and uses it to try and undermine the Trinity, which Baxter had been horrified by. So,
Right.
yeah, there was this kind of modalistic danger that people were worried about. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think we're done. Simon, thank you so much, not just for the excellent paper, but for fielding questions so well and opening up discussion and getting us to think hard. And so finally, to finish off, thanks to all of you who participated, both today and for this session. And we'll be in touch about what happens after the summer. Hope some of you will be able to join us. So again, thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
You.
Good to see you, Patrick. Great to see everyone.
Cheers, folks.
Yes.